What you're about to hear is a devastating takedown of academic pretension. This is Noam Chomsky, a guy who's forgotten more about linguistics, politics, and intellectual rigor than most professors will ever know, absolutely eviscerating the postmodern academic establishment. And he does it with the kind of surgical precision that can only come from someone who's been watching these charlatans operate for decades.
But if you look at the phenomenon as a whole, its effect has been, I think the effect is pretty clear. It allows people to take a very radical stance, more radical than thou, but to be completely dissociated from anything that's happening for many reasons. One reason is nobody can understand a word they're saying, so they're already dissociated. It's kind of like a private lingo, and it's very, there's a lot of material reward that comes from it. Like if you're part of that system, you can run around to conferences and get big professorships and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of sort of conventional material reward, and it has this very radical look to it.
Right here, Chomsky cuts to the heart of the postmodern scam. These people have created the perfect intellectual circle jerk. They get to cosplay as revolutionaries while contributing absolutely nothing to actual social change. The incomprehensibility isn't a bug, it's a feature. When you can't understand what someone is saying, you can't challenge it, you can't verify it, and you definitely can't apply it to solve real problems. The obscurity becomes a shield. But here's the real kicker: this isn't about changing the world, it's about career advancement. These professors have figured out how to monetize incomprehensibility. They're not revolutionaries, they're entrepreneurs selling confusion to other confused people. The whole system becomes a pyramid scheme where the currency is pretentious jargon and the payout is tenure, conference invitations, and the ability to look down on people who use clear language. It's the perfect scam. You get all the benefits of being a respectable academic, steady paycheck, social status, intellectual credibility, while also getting to feel like a dangerous radical who's challenging the system. It's rebellion without risk, revolution without consequences. You can critique capitalism while collecting a six-figure salary from an institution funded by capitalist donors. You can rail against power structures while being part of the most privileged class in human history.
So you feel, well, let me just give you an example. I gave a talk a couple days, last Saturday, at Birzeit University, the Palestinian University at the West Bank. And it was like everywhere, big mass audience, political talk, mostly criticizing the Palestinian Authority, because I was in, you always tell people what they don't want to hear. So I want to criticize Israel, I do it on the other side of the border. The audience, most of the audience, very supportive, and they liked it and they understood it. The guys with the jackets and ties were pretty angry, but that's normal. However, as I left with an Arab friend of mine who organized it, he's actually an Arab, he's an Israeli Arab who's a member of the Knesset, the parliament, but an old kind of good guy. He was sitting in the back of the, and he as we walked out, he kind of laughed and he told me that he said most of the, especially younger people, liked it a lot, but he heard one really critical comment from a young woman faculty member who sort of liked the general political thrust of it, but told him it was very naive. And I said, why was it naive? And he laughed and he said, well, it's because you said that people do things on moral grounds and you talked about truth. Okay? And that's old-fashioned nonsense. That's kind of this old Enlightenment stuff. We know perfectly well that nobody does it.
This is where the postmodern death cult reveals its true nature. Here's a young faculty member, safely ensconced in academia, calling practical political analysis naive. This is the classic postmodern move: dismiss anyone who talks about actually changing things as hopelessly unsophisticated. The real world is for naive people. Sophisticated thinkers know better than to believe in silly things like moral progress or truth. The arrogance here is staggering. We know perfectly well, who's this we? The faculty lounge? The conference circuit? The people who've never actually organized anything or fought for anything? They've decided that moral action is impossible because it doesn't fit their theoretical framework. This is the postmodern endgame. the abolition of truth itself. Once you eliminate the possibility of objective truth, you can say anything and defend nothing. Every position becomes equally valid, which means no position is worth defending. It's the perfect philosophy for people who want to sound smart without ever having to be right about anything. If nobody acts on moral grounds and truth doesn't exist, then what's the point of trying to change anything? Why fight apartheid if it's just one narrative competing with another? Why oppose oppression if moral judgment is just a naive Enlightenment concept?
I mean, I talked about how apartheid was overthrown, and how it was necessary to have splits inside the white society, which there were. If the white society had been unified, they would have smashed the ANC. But there were splits from the inside, and basically on moral grounds. People didn't want to tolerate it, and that was quite important. Something, talked about that. Well, that's naive, because nobody does anything on moral grounds. All power plays, read Foucault, and so on and so forth.
Apartheid wasn't overthrown by clever theoretical frameworks or postmodern critique. It was overthrown by people who believed in moral action, who thought truth mattered, who were willing to risk everything for principles that postmodern academics dismiss as naive. The disconnect between theory and practice couldn't be clearer. This is what actual political analysis looks like. Chomsky understands that social change happens when people decide certain things are morally intolerable and act on that conviction. The postmodern professor would probably write a paper about how the concept of tolerance is socially constructed and therefore meaningless. Meanwhile, real people suffered under apartheid, and other real people fought to end it because they believed suffering was wrong and freedom was right. The postmodern reduction of everything to power games isn't sophisticated analysis, it's intellectual laziness. When you decide that everything is just competing power structures, you don't have to make moral judgments, you don't have to take sides, and you don't have to risk being wrong. It's the ultimate cop-out disguised as deep thinking.
If you can understand it. And truth is kind of like an old-fashioned concept, there's no truth, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that stuff goes on all over. I mean, the next day I gave a talk at an Israeli university, and then it was critical of Israel and the United States, and talk about the Palestinians. And there were commentators, and one of the commentators was the dean, and he hated it, of course, and a historian. And he also said it was naive, because I was talking as if there's a objectivity in history. I was running through the history of what happened and saying how you should interpret what's going on now in those terms. It is complete naive. I mean, everybody knows there's no objectivity and there's no truth, and it's this narrative and that narrative and so on and so forth. That's very convenient. It sounds very radical, and it's extremely convenient. You can beat people over the head with perfect self-confidence, because there's no reality anyway, and it's just their narrative and your narrative. In the third world,
Chomsky nails it. Postmodernism is convenient above all else. It's convenient for professors who don't want to be held accountable for their claims. It's convenient for institutions that want to appear progressive without actually changing anything. It's convenient for activists who want to feel revolutionary without taking any real risks. But here's the truly insidious part: this framework becomes a weapon. When there's no objective reality, you can beat people over the head with perfect self-confidence, because you never have to prove anything. You can dismiss any criticism as just another narrative, any evidence as just another construction. It's the perfect shield against accountability, the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for intellectual charlatans.
It's particularly grotesque in my opinion. It's bad enough here, I don't like it here, or other rich countries, but when you get to third world countries, it's really grotesque, because there the separation of the radical intelligentsia from popular struggle is much more, it shows much more dramatically. I mean, people are much poorer and they're suffering much more, and these guys are usually very rich, in fact, often, and it's ugly.
The postmodern academic game is bad enough in rich countries, but when you export it to places where people are actually suffering, it becomes genuinely obscene. You have wealthy academics in the global south spinning theories about how truth doesn't exist while people around them are dying from preventable diseases, living in poverty, and fighting for basic human rights. The separation between the radical intelligentsia and popular struggle becomes a chasm. These professors get to feel sophisticated and radical while being completely disconnected from the actual struggles of the people they claim to represent. It's class warfare disguised as intellectual sophistication, the rich telling the poor that their suffering is just a social construction, their desire for justice just another narrative.
But I think it has served a function. I don't want to say that the people who are involved in it necessarily do it for this reason. In fact, I know extremely good people who are very active and I respect and like and so on, who are right in this stuff. I don't know why, but means something to them. But as a general phenomenon, I think that's the way it's worked. It's worked as a way of insulating sectors of a kind of radical intelligentsia from popular movements and actual activism, and it served as an instrument of power. I suspect that's the reason why it's so readily tolerated in the universities. I mean, it's all over the place, in the third world as well, because of the function it serves.
Here's Chomsky revealing their function. Postmodernism isn't just wrong, it's actively harmful to the causes it claims to support. It has served as an instrument of power by neutralizing potential opposition. The radical intelligentsia gets to feel revolutionary while being completely separated from actual revolutionary activity. This is why the universities tolerate it, why the establishment doesn't see it as a threat. It's not dangerous to power, it serves power by channeling intellectual energy into meaningless theoretical exercises. It's the perfect safety valve. Let the radicals play with their theories while the real world continues unchanged. Chomsky's careful to say that many of the people involved are good people with good intentions. But intentions don't matter when the effect is to neuter actual opposition and serve the interests of the powerful. The road to irrelevance is paved with good intentions and incomprehensible prose.
I have to say that a lot of postmodern work I just don't understand, so I can't comment on it.
This is the ultimate insult from one of the world's most respected intellectuals. I just don't understand it. When Noam Chomsky, a guy who revolutionized linguistics, wrote groundbreaking work on political theory, and can discuss complex philosophical concepts with ease, says he can't understand postmodern work, that's not a confession of intellectual inadequacy. That's a diagnosis of intellectual fraud. The reference to Sokal and Brickmont's book is particularly brutal. These physicists, who Chomsky notes are political radicals themselves, systematically demolished postmodern claims about science. They showed that when postmodern theorists venture into areas where objective knowledge is possible, they reveal themselves to be either frauds or fools. The emperor's new clothes get stripped away when you can actually check the math.
It seems to me some exercise by intellectuals who are talking to each other in very obscure ways, and I can't follow it, and I don't know if anybody else can. Postmodern views of science, by and large, have been pretty embarrassing, I think. There's some interesting work on this. There's a book by two physicists, Jean Brickmont and Alain Sokal, both of whom happen to be political radicals, just running through, it's mostly Paris postmodernism, what postmodern commentators have said about science. And it is really embarrassing. I mean, to the extent you can understand it. I mean, on the other hand, there is a point. I mean, insofar as they say that everything that people do is some kind of social construction, depends on the historic context, cultural context, that part's true. I don't know if you need the whole postmodern baggage to say those things. My feeling is not. At least personally, I haven't seen anything that it doesn't seem to me has to be said in anything but monosyllables. It looks, insofar as I understand it, it's pretty straightforward. And I get the feeling that it's kind of, I mean, there isn't a drive among intellectuals to make things look difficult. It's a kind of self-protection. I mean, if what I'm doing can be done by, the guy who's repairing my furnace, okay, then who am I, and then there's those physicists over there who talk complicated things and have to, and I don't understand them, so I'd like to be like them, That drive is clearly there, and I think it should be resisted. I mean, if we can say things simply so that people can understand them, we should.
Here's Chomsky being characteristically fair. He acknowledges that postmodernism contains some valid insights about social construction and historical context. But then he delivers the killing blow. You don't need the postmodern baggage to say these things. The valid insights can be expressed clearly, in simple language that ordinary people can understand. This gets to the heart of the intellectual fraud. The postmodern apparatus isn't necessary for the insights, it's necessary for the career advancement. The complexity is designed to create artificial scarcity. If anyone can understand these ideas, then what makes the postmodern professor special? The jargon isn't about precision, it's about exclusion. Chomsky exposes the psychological mechanism behind postmodern obscurity, intellectual insecurity. These academics are terrified that their insights might be accessible to ordinary people, because that would threaten their special status. They suffer from physics envy. They see how complex and difficult real science is, and they want to simulate that complexity in their own work. But here's the crucial difference. Physics is difficult because reality is complex. Postmodern theory is difficult because it's deliberately obscured. When physicists use complex mathematics, it's because they're trying to describe complex phenomena as precisely as possible. When postmodern theorists use complex language, it's because they're trying to make simple ideas sound profound. The drive to make things look difficult is a form of intellectual dishonesty. It's the opposite of what education should be about. Real intellectuals try to make complex ideas accessible. Fake intellectuals try to make simple ideas inaccessible. Chomsky's commitment to clear communication isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a moral commitment to democratic education and intellectual honesty. What you've just witnessed is more than just an academic debate, it's a wholesale dismantling of one of the most successful intellectual frauds in modern history. Postmodernism has managed to colonize entire university departments, influence government policy, and shape public discourse, all while contributing essentially nothing to human knowledge or social progress. The genius of Chomsky's critique is that he doesn't just attack postmodernism from the outside, he shows how it fails on its own terms. These theorists claim to be radicals, but they serve power. They claim to champion the oppressed, but they're disconnected from actual struggle. They claim to offer sophisticated analysis, but they can't even explain their ideas clearly. The postmodern project represents the ultimate corruption of the intellectual enterprise. Instead of using their privilege and resources to understand the world and fight injustice, these academics have created an elaborate system for avoiding both understanding and action. They've turned the university into a kind of intellectual theme park where you can play at being a revolutionary without any of the risks or responsibilities that real revolution entails. What makes this particularly infuriating is that we're living through a period of genuine crisis: climate change, inequality, authoritarianism, technological disruption, and the people who should be helping us understand and respond to these challenges are instead locked in their offices writing papers about how understanding and response are impossible. The postmodern emperor has no clothes, but he's got tenure, and that's apparently enough. The greatest tragedy isn't that these ideas are wrong. Lots of ideas are wrong. The tragedy is that they've been so successful at neutralizing intellectual opposition to the status quo while pretending to be revolutionary. They've created a generation of pseudo-radicals who think changing the world is as simple as changing the discourse, who mistake theoretical sophistication for practical wisdom, and who have confused making things complicated with making them profound. Chomsky's critique cuts through all the bullshit with a clarity that only comes from someone who's spent his life actually trying to understand the world and change it. He shows us what intellectual honesty looks like, what genuine radicalism requires, and why we should resist the drive to make things needlessly complex. In a world full of postmodern charlatans, Chomsky reminds us what a real intellectual looks like: someone who uses their knowledge to serve humanity rather than their own ego. The postmodern project is dying, killed by its own contradictions and irrelevance. But its death throes are still causing damage, still distracting us from the real work that needs to be done. Chomsky's analysis helps us understand why this happened and how to avoid making the same mistakes again. In a time when clear thinking and honest communication are more important than ever, his words are a reminder that intellectual integrity isn't just an academic virtue, it's a necessity for human survival.